can you just talk about your area of focus and what you have looked at zebra mussels-wise?
Well, my area of expertise is, lakes, rivers, wetlands, in particular nutrient cycles and food webs. And in the Great Lakes, I've been involved in studies of Dreissena and its impacts, that is zebra mussels and quagga mussels, and their impacts on Great Lakes, both as a researcher and also during that period I was a member of the Science Advisory Board of the International Joint Commission.
Could you just talk about what zebra mussels are and their effects?
Well, zebra mussels are mollusks. That is the group that contains clams and snails and mussels in particular. So they're bivalve mollusks, so they have two shells left and right like our freshwater clams, which are actually mussels that we have had in North America all along. But what's different about these mussels in particular is that they have a planktonic stage in their life cycle, so they have larvae that swim and move around in the plankton passively and then settle, like the blue mussel does that we buy in grocery stores and eat from the east coast of Canada, say. So they have a life cycle like the blue mussel, and unlike any of the other freshwater mussels that are native to Canada.
Okay, how do they reproduce?
Well, they reproduce sexually, and they produce eggs that they shed into the plankton. The eggs hatch. They go through a brief stage called a trochophore, and then a veliger stage that's longer lived, that swims around, feeds in the plankton like other zooplankton do, and then they settle to the bottom and attach with threads that are, the technical term is byssal threads. They attach firmly to the substrate, whether it be rock or stones, and then they filter feed from that location and grow to not very big. The biggest ones you'll see maybe would be an inch long.
Zebra mussels are filter feeders. Can you explain what that means?
Well, like our other freshwater clams, they have two siphons, or a water inlet and a water outlet. They bring water through the in-current siphon and pass it over their gills, which also is their way of acquiring oxygen or respiring. But in doing so, they also catch the particles that are in the water and direct them with the action of cilia, that is fine hairs on the gills, towards their mouth, or reject them through the excurrent siphon along with the water that goes out. So, they essentially filter fine particles from the water, and as far as they're concerned, the fine particles they're after are the phytoplankton.
In water that they do filter, what happens to those bodies of water?
Well, the most noticeable and first impact we notice in the Great Lakes is a decline in phytoplankton. So they grow very densely on the bottom of a lake or river if there's hard substrate, thousands per square meter, and they can clear the water, and that was the first effect that was noticed in the Great Lakes. The secondary effect that we noticed not long after is because they're also excreting nutrients like any animal, then when they filter feed, they release nutrients back into the water as feces and other waste, and that nourishes the algae that are also attached to hard surfaces like rocks and bedrock, and causes those algae to grow. So after the clearing of the water, the next sort of effect that was noticed was massive growth of algae along the shoreline.
So is this something we're going to be seeing in Lake Winnipeg and other bodies of water in Manitoba that happen in the Great Lakes?
It's not unlikely. I think I haven't heard that is happening to a level that people are noticing yet. From the experience around Ontario, it certainly happened in all of the lower Great Lakes, like Lake Ontario, Eastern Lake Erie, Lake Huron, Lake Michigan. But, for example, they colonized Lake Simcoe, which is a pretty large body of water, and they grew to very high densities, but they didn't seem to have such dramatic effects, and I don't think we fully understand why that is.
Does the temperature of a body of water, or just the region where the water is, affect growth or how many there are?
Yes, probably does. Of course, they're not tropical creatures, but I'm sure temperature affects growth like it does for all animals, although they're certainly capable of withstanding the harsh climate of Canada. Southern Ontario is a little cooler than Canada, but, they're doing well throughout the Great Lakes region. I don't think temperature would keep them out of southern or central Manitoba. One thing they do like, though, is harder water with a higher mineral content, so that categorizes the Great Lakes. It's hard water, but I don't expect to see them, and we haven't really had them invading waters, soft waters like you get on the Canadian Shield.
So they cluster. Do they need to form colonies or cluster in order to survive, or is that just a trait?
No, they don't need to do that, but the only place where they need to do it, if they're attached to a rock or a stone, they're fine. They could be one, there could be many, that's all good. What they can also do in areas where there's soft sediment, like, mud and that, they can attach to a piece of mussel shell or a stone or a twig and gradually form concretions of, hundreds of mussels and start to colonize those areas where, like, one mussel wouldn't really be able to do well because it would find nowhere or have trouble finding a place to attach.
Okay. Do you know if it affects infrastructure at all?
Oh, well, in the Great Lakes, it caused a lot of problems with infrastructure, like water intakes are the biggest problem. They will grow on the inside of a water intake plant. That's just a great place for them because there's water moving by all the time, whereas, still water is a problem for them because they deplete the water right around where they live. So moving water really is a big help to them. So on the inside of a water intake pipe, they'll grow massively in there until they essentially close it. And so it causes problems for engineers running power plants or water plants, things of that nature.
Okay. When they wash up on beaches, is there a specific reason for that?
Well, they usually only wash up on beaches after they're dead. They don't live that long, maybe a few years. They do have natural enemies, and so when they wash up on beaches, I don't think, as far as I'm aware, it doesn't reflect any kind of a mass mortality or that kind of event. It's just that they're so abundant, and when they die, their shells would persist for a long time. And so that on certain beaches, you end up with a lot of shell material on the shoreline.
The changes that happen in the bodies of water, can they be reversed at any time?
They could be. I mean, I think it's still, in the Great Lakes, it's still an unfolding story. I've heard anecdotally, I haven't seen data, that the mussels aren't abundant as they first were. And if that's true, perhaps some of the impacts are not dramatic. Some of the worst instances of fouling, the massive growths of algae that fouled beaches deeply, I don't know that they're still occurring to the same degree. And one of the changes that's happened in the Great Lakes is that some years after the mussel first appeared, or the mussels, we had an invading fish species called the round goby that actually eats the mussels fairly effectively. Some of the native species also eat mussels, but particular fish seems to do rather well, got to very high numbers, again, dozens per square meter of these fish, and they probably are depressing the mussel populations now somewhat, but I've never heard of any means of eradicating them or removing them once they're established.
Is there a way to stop the spread at all?
Well, the most important thing, once they're in an area, the major vector getting them from one place to another is probably recreational boaters. And so in the Great Lakes area, on both sides of the border, there are programs put in place for people to, requiring people or encouraging people to clean their boats as they move them from one lake to another. Live wells, the hull, all of those, like these are mussels that can attach and close. They can spend hours out of water and survive. Plus, the larvae could live in live wells or bilges and that kind of thing. And that's probably how they spread around once they get into an area.
Is there anything else that you think is important for people to know about zebra mussels?
Well, the other thing is an invasive species hotline and a rapid response program. So, for example, if someone in the public notices zebra mussels or another invasive species, because there's lots of them now with international trade being what it is, they should have and they should be aware, there should be lots of advertising for what you do and who you call. It's like Ghostbusters, who do you call? And that information should be in the public's mind, and then there should be people, presumably government employees, that have the tools they need to do a rapid response. And in some cases, it may be possible to nip an invasion in the bud.
Well, thank you for taking the time for this interview.